The story of the Great Raid on Cabanatuan begins not with a plan for rescue, but with a warning born out of fire. In late 1944, American forces pushing into the Philippines were met by a small group of men whose survival defied every expectation. These were the survivors of the Palawan Massacre, men who had escaped a prisoner camp where Japanese guards burned prisoners alive and shot them as they fled. Barely clinging to life, these survivors were taken to American lines and questioned by military intelligence. Their voices were thin and their bodies were nearly skeletal, but what they described forced American commanders to face a brutal truth. The Japanese had issued strict orders that if Allied forces moved too close to any prisoner of war camp, every prisoner inside was to be executed. No exceptions. This meant that time was running out. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners still held across the Philippines were in immediate danger. Among these camps, one location held particular urgency. It was known as the Cabanatuan Prisoner of War Camp, a place where more than 500 American soldiers remained. These men were not just ordinary prisoners. Many were survivors of the Bataan Death March, men who had endured years of starvation and torture. Some were so weak they could barely stand. Others were clinging to life through sheer will. American commanders quickly realized that the massacre at Palawan was not an isolated act of brutality. It was a preview of what could happen at Cabanatuan if they did not act quickly. General Douglas MacArthur authorized an immediate plan to rescue the prisoners. The task was given to the 6th Ranger Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci. The mission was simple to describe but nearly impossible to execute. The Rangers would have to travel deep behind enemy lines, attack a heavily guarded camp, kill the guards, and evacuate more than 500 sick and starving prisoners. They would then need to escort them back through miles of enemy territory before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. To strengthen their chances, the Rangers would work with Filipino guerrilla fighters. These guerrillas were some of the most experienced fighters in the region. They had lived through the Japanese occupation for years and had intimate knowledge of every river crossing, trail, hill, and patrol route. Two guerrilla commanders in particular became essential to the mission: Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Joson. Pajota was known for his calm leadership and sharp tactical mind. Joson was respected for his courage and unwavering loyalty to his men. Their forces would play a critical role in blocking Japanese reinforcements and leading the Rangers through dangerous terrain. Before any rescue attempt could begin, the Rangers needed eyes inside the area around the Cabanatuan camp. This responsibility fell to the Alamo Scouts, an elite reconnaissance unit trained to infiltrate enemy lines silently and gather intelligence without being detected. On January 27th, a team of Alamo Scouts began observing the camp from hidden positions. They painstakingly counted guards, patrol patterns, tower positions, and escape routes. They even recorded the times when lights were turned on or off inside the camp. Their reports provided the crucial foundation for the rescue plan. The camp itself sat in a large open field surrounded by rice paddies that offered little cover. Guard towers watched every angle, and Japanese troops were stationed in nearby towns. The Alamo Scouts learned that several hundred Japanese soldiers were located just across the Kabu River within striking distance of the camp. If the Rangers were discovered early, these reinforcements could annihilate the rescue force and murder every prisoner before they could be reached. Despite the danger, Mucci insisted on one thing above all else: no prisoners would die because of friendly fire. He told his Rangers that if any prisoner ran in panic during the assault, they were to shield him with their own bodies rather than risk shooting him. For Mucci, the lives of the prisoners mattered more than anything else. With intelligence gathered, the Rangers began their long approach toward Cabanatuan. They marched at night to avoid detection, traveling through jungle, tall grass, and muddy fields while crouching low and moving silently. The terrain was brutal. Men slipped into deep mud that nearly swallowed them. Others waded through icy streams that soaked their uniforms. Every sound had to be controlled. A single misstep could alert a Japanese patrol. Filipino civilians helped guide them, sometimes walking barefoot to reduce noise. They warned the Rangers of enemy patrols and pointed out hidden paths behind villages. Many of these civilians risked their lives. If Japanese troops found out that they had helped Americans, the punishment was execution, often carried out in front of their own families. On the evening of January 28th, The Rangers reached Balinkaran, a small village still under threat from Japanese forces. They rested briefly, but sleep was nearly impossible. The thought of more than 500 prisoners waiting inside the camp weighed heavily on them. They knew those men had survived 3 years of abuse and starvation. They also knew that if the Japanese decided to execute the prisoners, it could happen at any moment. The next day, the Rangers moved again, crossing more dangerous ground. They crawled through open fields, while Japanese trucks rumbled along nearby roads. At one point, they pressed their bodies into the dirt as headlights swept across the field only a short distance away. Their uniforms were soaked, their knees raw, and their bodies exhausted, but the mission demanded complete silence and patience. When the Rangers finally arrived near Cabanatuan on January 30th, they met with Captain Pahota and Captain Josin. The Filipino guerrillas had gathered vital intelligence of their own. They reported that Japanese troops across the Kabu River were active and could mobilize quickly if they heard gunfire. Pahota proposed setting an ambush on the bridge that crossed the river. This would buy the Rangers precious time once the assault began. There was another problem. The open fields surrounding the camp made it nearly impossible for the Rangers to approach without being seen. Any movement during daylight would be spotted instantly by tower guards. Captain Prince decided the only option was to crawl across the field under the cover of darkness, moving slowly to avoid detection. The Alamo Scouts confirmed that this was the only realistic approach. Now the mission depended on perfect timing. The Rangers needed a distraction to keep the guards looking away from the field. Captain Prince requested help from the United States Army Air Forces. A P-61 Black Widow, a night fighter aircraft, would fly low over the camp at just the right moment. The pilot would pretend to have engine trouble, shutting the engines off and gliding silently, then restarting them repeatedly. This trick would draw the guards' attention skyward, giving the Rangers the window they needed to crawl forward. As night fell, the men prepared for the assault. They checked their weapons, tightened their gear, and whispered final reminders to one another. Some quietly prayed. Others focused on slowing their breathing. Every man knew that once the attack began, there would be no turning back. The lives of more than 500 prisoners depended entirely on what happened in the hours ahead. The Rangers positioned themselves in the tall grass, waiting for the P-61 to begin its run over the camp. The air was heavy and still. The field seemed endless. Japanese guards could be heard talking and walking along their patrol routes. The Rangers lay completely motionless, listening to the distant hum of the aircraft approaching. This was the moment when everything would either come together or fall apart. The P-61 Black Widow appeared as a faint hum in the distance, barely noticeable at first. Its engines cut out suddenly, and the plane glided silently over the camp like a dark shadow drifting across the sky. The Japanese guards looked upward, their attention focused completely on the strange behavior of the aircraft. Just as planned, the pilot restarted the engines, letting the roar echo across the open fields. The guards pointed and shouted, trying to figure out if the aircraft was damaged or preparing for an attack. They had no idea that 90 Rangers were lying only a few hundred yards away, inching forward through the grass like ghosts. Captain Robert Prince gave a hand signal, and the Rangers began the slow crawl toward the camp. They moved on their stomachs, pushing themselves forward with their elbows and knees. The grass scratched their skin, and the mud clung to their uniforms. Some men crawled for nearly an hour, advancing only a few feet at a time. The tower guards could not hear them over the engine noise of the P-61, and the darkness helped conceal their movement. Every Ranger knew that if even one man made too much noise, the entire mission would collapse before it began. While the Rangers crept into position, Captain Juan Pahota and his Filipino guerrilla fighters prepared to block the main road leading to the camp. Pahota positioned his men near the Kabu River Bridge, where hundreds of Japanese soldiers were stationed. He ordered his men to hold their fire unless absolutely necessary. The goal was to strike hard and fast when reinforcements attempted to cross the bridge, but not to draw attention too early. Pahota knew that if the Japanese on the other side of the river realized an attack was happening at Cabanatuan, they could send a large force that would overwhelm the Rangers and massacre the prisoners. The Rangers reached the final crawling point and lay in silence as Captain Prince prepared the assault teams. Prince planned the attack with incredible precision. There would be no warning shots, no shouted orders. The attack had to begin with sudden and overwhelming force. Tower guards needed to be eliminated immediately before they could fire into the prisoners' barracks. American lives depended on perfect accuracy in the first moments of the attack. And at 7:40 p.m., Prince gave the signal. A ranger fired the first shot, hitting a guard in one of the towers. Seconds later, the entire perimeter erupted in gunfire. Rangers shot out the legs of the watchtowers to keep the guards from firing down at the prisoners. Another team stormed the front gate, throwing grenades and cutting through barriers. Filipino guerrillas surrounding the outer edges joined in the assault, taking down fleeing Japanese soldiers who tried to regroup. Inside the camp, chaos exploded instantly. Many prisoners had expected this night to be their last. When the gunfire erupted, some thought the Japanese had begun executing them. Weaker prisoners crawled under their beds or huddled together in fear. Others tried to stand but fell back to the ground, their legs unable to support them. For a moment, confusion spread across the camp. Then the Rangers broke through the barracks. "Americans, we are Americans. You are being rescued." Those words shattered the prisoners' fear and replaced it with overwhelming emotion. Some prisoners cried openly, unable to believe what they were hearing. Others tried to run toward the Rangers but collapsed due to exhaustion. The rescuers carried men out on their backs, while others supported prisoners by taking their arms and lifting them to their feet. One prisoner, weighing barely 90 pounds, fainted the moment a ranger placed his hand on his shoulder. Another prisoner kept repeating over and over, "I knew you would come. I knew you would come." The Rangers moved quickly from hut to hut, clearing each area of Japanese guards and then lifting prisoners to safety. Meanwhile, Captain Mucci coordinated the evacuation outside the camp. His goal was to get the prisoners moving as fast as possible because he knew reinforcements could arrive at any moment. Back at the Kabu River, Pahota and his guerrillas heard the gunfire from the camp and knew the Japanese would be responding soon. They watched as a column of soldiers gathered on the far side of the bridge, preparing to cross. Pahota waited until the Japanese reached the middle of the bridge, then gave the order to open fire. Guerrilla riflemen, machine gunners, and scouts unleashed a devastating volley. Japanese soldiers fell in large numbers, and those still standing retreated in confusion. Pahota then detonated explosives placed on the sides of the road and riverbank, blowing apart the front of the enemy column. This created a barricade of debris, bodies, and twisted metal that blocked the path to Cabanatuan. The explosion lit the night sky, and Japanese commanders on the far side of the river shouted frantic orders to reorganize their troops. Pahota's men fired relentlessly, making sure no one could cross the bridge. Their courage and precision under fire prevented an entire battalion of Japanese soldiers from interfering with the rescue. Meanwhile, inside the camp, the Rangers continued eliminating pockets of resistance. A few Japanese soldiers attempted to hide or blend in with the prisoners, but the Rangers quickly identified and neutralized them. One group of guards tried to retreat toward the rear of the camp, but Filipino guerrillas waiting outside cut them down before they could escape. With the guards eliminated, the Rangers faced their next challenge. They needed to move more than 500 prisoners, many barely able to walk, across dangerous terrain under the cover of night. Some prisoners were carried on makeshift stretchers made from blankets and wooden poles. Others were loaded onto carabao carts driven by Filipino civilians who had volunteered to help. These civilians guided the carts through muddy paths, over small bridges, and around obstacles in the dark, knowing they were risking their lives. The column began moving away from the camp as quickly as possible. Rangers formed protective lines around the prisoners, ready to defend them if Japanese troops emerged from the surrounding hills or villages. Every few minutes, a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion, and a ranger or guerrilla would pick him up and carry him forward. Some prisoners apologized for slowing the group down, but the rescuers simply lifted them higher and continued moving. No one would be left behind. As the group moved farther from the camp, distant gunfire continued to echo from the direction of the Kabu River. Pahota's men were still holding the line against a larger Japanese force, ensuring that reinforcements could not break through. Their position was critical. If they were pushed back, hundreds of American prisoners could be trapped and overrun, but Pahota's fighters held strong. The night was filled with tension. The Rangers knew the enemy could appear at any moment. They needed to get the prisoners to a safe crossing point where bamboo rafts and boats waited along a calm section of the Pampanga River. Guerrillas guided the group toward this location, moving silently through the tall grass and trees. The moonlight provided just enough illumination to keep the column together without revealing them to Japanese patrols. As they continued their escape, several prisoners asked if the rescue was real or if they were dreaming. Some questioned whether they were strong enough to survive the journey. Rangers reassured them as they walked, promising that they would make it home. The determination of both rescuers and prisoners turned fear into hope. It was the first time in years that many of these men believed they might live to see another day. The river crossing was the next great challenge ahead, and the fate of hundreds of freed prisoners hung in the balance as the column approached the dark water. The rangers and prisoners moved through the darkness toward the riverbank, guided by the quiet instructions of Filipino guerrillas who knew every bend in the land. The night air was cool, but many of the prisoners were feverish and shaking from malaria, dysentery, or exhaustion. Some leaned heavily on the rangers supporting them. Others whispered prayers of thanks that they had made it this far. The sound of distant gunfire from Pajota's position was still echoing across the fields like a reminder that time was running out. If the Japanese broke through at the river bridge, they would sweep across the countryside and destroy everything the rescue force had achieved. The river flowed quietly in the moonlight, dark and reflective, bordered by tall grasses that rustled in the faint wind. The guerrillas had prepared bamboo rafts earlier in the day, tying long poles together and reinforcing them with crossbeams. Carabao carts had also brought several small boats to the river, dragged through the mud by civilians who volunteered to help. These rafts and boats were the only way to get the weakest prisoners across safely. Many prisoners were so dehydrated and starved that any attempt to swim would have ended in disaster. Rangers positioned themselves along the river to help load the prisoners onto the makeshift vessels. Some of the men trembled as they stepped toward the water, terrified they might fall in and be swept away. A few prisoners asked if the Japanese were waiting on the other side. Rangers assured them it was clear, although no one could be entirely certain. The rescue force had to trust in the intelligence gathered by guerrillas earlier in the day. One by one, the prisoners were placed onto rafts and boats. The bamboo creaked under the weight, but it held. Guerrillas pushed the rafts off the shore and waded into the water, guiding the vessels with long poles. The current was gentle, but every movement had to be controlled. If a raft tipped or a boat overturned, the survivors could drown before anyone could reach them. The rangers stood along the bank, watching each vessel drift across the moonlit river toward safety. As the last groups reached the opposite shore, rangers carried prisoners off the rafts and helped them to their feet. Some men were unable to stand and had to be lifted onto carts waiting nearby. Filipino civilians had prepared these carts in advance, knowing that speed was now more important than silence. Once the group cleared the riverbank, the rescuers began the final stage of the escape. Behind them, the sound of gunfire at the Cabu River suddenly intensified. Pajota and his men were still fighting off the Japanese forces attempting to cross the bridge. The Japanese commanders on the far bank had finally realized that the gunfire near Cabanatuan was part of a coordinated assault, not a small skirmish. They launched a series of desperate attacks, trying to storm across the bridge to rescue what remained of the guard garrison at the camp. Each time they surged forward, Pajota's fighters met them with deadly accuracy. Guerrilla machine gunners held their ground even as the enemy outnumbered them. The bridge became a choke point, littered with debris, bodies, and the shattered remains of Japanese vehicles. Despite repeated attempts, the Japanese never managed to break through. Meanwhile, the long line of prisoners and rescuers continued moving deeper into friendly territory. Some prisoners asked how much farther they needed to go. Rangers gave them simple answers. Not much longer. Stay with us. Keep moving. For many of the men, each step felt like a battle. Their feet were blistered, their stomachs cramped, and their bodies drained by years of mistreatment. But the promise of freedom pushed them forward. The guerrillas scouted ahead, clearing the road of any potential threats. They moved quickly, whispering signals to one another and using their knowledge of the terrain to guide the column around obstacles. At several points along the route, villagers emerged from huts and small homes, offering whatever food or water they had to the escaping prisoners. Some gave coconut water or small pieces of bread. Others provided blankets. Many of these civilians had lived under brutal Japanese occupation and saw the rescue as a moment of hope. As the column moved farther from the danger zone, the tension slowly shifted into relief. One prisoner broke down in tears when he realized he was no longer within the sound of enemy gunfire. Another man touched the shoulder of the ranger, helping him walk, and whispered, "I thought I would die in that camp." The ranger simply nodded and told him, "Not tonight, not on our watch." Hours passed as they pushed onward. The sky began to lighten in the east, signaling that dawn was approaching. The rescuers could now see the outlines of trees, fields, and distant hills. The first rays of sunlight revealed the faces of the prisoners, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and bodies worn thin from starvation. Yet many of them were smiling for the first time in years. As they neared American lines, a few prisoners became emotional, overcome by the realization that they had survived something unimaginable. Some talked about home. Others mentioned families they hoped were still waiting for them. A ranger walking beside them said that they would all get the medical care they needed as soon as they reached the field hospital. The prisoners clung to that promise. When they finally reached friendly territory, American soldiers rushed to meet them. Medics immediately assisted the weakest of the group, laying them on stretchers and offering water and medical supplies. Some of the prisoners were carried directly to ambulances, while others limped forward on their own, determined to walk the last few steps. The moment the first prisoner crossed into the safety of American lines, a wave of relief washed over the rescue force. Rangers who had remained calm through the entire operation finally allowed themselves to breathe fully. Guerrilla fighters shook hands with the Rangers, their faces showing both pride and exhaustion. Some of the prisoners saluted the men who had saved them, while others simply whispered thank you with tears in their eyes. The Great Raid was almost complete, but the story was not over. The prisoners still needed treatment, the rescuers needed to be debriefed, and the full impact of the mission was about to be felt across the world. The rescued prisoners were brought to the nearest field hospital, where doctors and nurses were already preparing to receive them. Many of the men had not seen proper medical care in years. Some were severely dehydrated, while others suffered from malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and long-term malnutrition. Medical staff worked through the night, giving fluids, food, and treatment. Several prisoners had to be carried directly onto cots because their legs could no longer support them after the long escape. Still, despite their condition, many of them continued asking if everyone else had made it out alive. News of the rescue reached American headquarters quickly. When General Douglas MacArthur received confirmation that the raid had succeeded and the prisoners were safe, he praised the Rangers, the Alamo Scouts, and the Filipino guerrillas for their bravery and precision. The operation had seemed nearly impossible, but the flawless execution proved that courage and preparation could overcome overwhelming odds. MacArthur later said that the Great Raid would be remembered as one of the finest acts of military skill and teamwork in the entire war. As the prisoners regained strength, many began sharing their stories with the soldiers and medics caring for them. Some talked about the Bataan Death March and the horrors they witnessed. Others described the brutal life inside the Cabanatuan camp, where disease and starvation were everyday realities. Several men explained how they had lost friends in the months and years before the rescue. One man told a ranger that he had stopped believing he would ever see freedom again, and that the sound of American voices breaking into the camp still felt unreal. Back at the battlefield, the full scale of what had happened began to emerge. The bodies of Japanese soldiers at the Kabu River crossing showed how fiercely Pajota and his fighters had defended the bridge. Their actions prevented a much larger force from reaching Cabanatuan and allowed the Rangers to complete the rescue without being overrun. Without the Filipino guerrillas, the mission would have failed. The guerrillas' knowledge of the land, their bravery under fire, and their willingness to fight alongside the Americans made the raid a true partnership between two forces united for a single goal. Across the Pacific, newspapers printed headlines describing the rescue as one of the most daring missions of the war. Families in the United States who had gone years without hearing from their loved ones suddenly learned that they were alive and safe. Letters poured into military offices, thanking the Rangers and guerrillas for bringing home men who had been given up for dead. Some families received phone calls directly from commanders informing them that their sons or brothers were among the rescued. Many of these conversations ended in tears of joy and relief. In the Philippines, the raid became a symbol of hope for people who had endured years of occupation. Filipino civilians who had helped guide the Rangers or provide food to prisoners were celebrated by their communities. Some villagers who had risked their lives now felt pride that their small acts of courage had contributed to one of the greatest rescues of the war. The cooperation between American and Filipino forces strengthened the bond between the two nations and reinforced the shared commitment to liberating the Philippines from Japanese control. The Great Raid also had a powerful impact on military strategy. In the decades that followed, the rescue became a model for future special operations. Rangers and other elite units studied the mission to learn how coordination, stealth, intelligence, and local partnerships could make dangerous operations successful. The lessons of the raid influenced how modern special forces plan missions, gather intelligence, and work with local allies. After the war ended, many of the Rangers and guerrillas returned home to quiet lives. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci continued his military career for several years before eventually moving into civilian work. Captain Robert Prince, the man who planned much of the assault, also returned home and rarely spoke about the mission. Captain Pajota and Captain Josen remained respected figures in the Philippines. Their leadership had changed the course of the operation and saved hundreds of lives. The rescued prisoners spent years rebuilding their health, both physically and emotionally. Many carried the trauma of captivity with them for the rest of their lives. Yet they also carried gratitude. They never forgot the men who risked everything to bring them home. During reunions and memorial events in the years that followed, survivors often spoke about the bravery of the Rangers and the guerrillas. They described the moment of rescue as a turning point in their lives, a moment when hope replaced despair. In time, the story of the Great Raid became a reminder of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to abandon one another. It showed that even in the darkest moments of war, courage, loyalty, and sacrifice could change history. The raid saved more than 500 American prisoners. It restored hope to countless families, and it proved that no distance was too far and no risk too great when lives were on the line. The Great Raid on Cabanatuan remains one of the most remarkable rescue missions in military history. It stands as a testament to the bravery of the Rangers, the skill of the Alamo Scouts, the unwavering determination of the Filipino guerrillas, and the resilience of the prisoners who survived years of unimaginable hardship. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.